Thank you very much for keeping right here on the Situation Room. This is Kenya's biggest conversation on Spice FM. 94.4 Nairobi, Mombasa 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, 96.0 in Nakuru, Eldoret 96.7, 90.9 in Nyeri, Malindi 97.7, and we're also broadcasting on KTN Home this morning for the next 1 hour, as well as www.spicefm.co.ke and Spice FM KE, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So let's talk about debt capital. Now, there's a man called Dr. Bitange Ndemo. Dr. Bitange Ndemo is well known. He was a permanent secretary in the government before they were called principal secretaries. He was PS in charge of information. He is a man who also played a very crucial role. You know what the PS, Dr. Karanja Kibisho, just told us about, digitization of government services and especially expansion of access to digital services for government. He played a key role. Now he works in various, he still serves in government in various functions, but as well as a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. He's a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Nairobi. Every so often, Dr. Ndemo will pen an article that will be published in the papers. He will appear somewhere and give a talk. He will, also appear in various events and workshops as a speaker. Recently, he penned an article that was titled Debt Capital, and he gave his own experience. Having gone to the US to study, he started working there, quit a well-paying job, came back to the country, and when he came back to the country, opportunities were not as forthcoming as, you'd expect. And then he ended up, doing some good business. But going back home, the people back at home would start saying, hey, so-and-so went to America. He came back. Now he's selling vegetables. This America, that guy went to drink.
Did he really go to America?
Did he really go to America? Or did he, all those things, right? And there's all this pressure in the community. Then that pressure comes into a point you want to show people back home that, you know what, yes, I went to Nairobi, but I'm doing well. So your neighbor or so-and-so wants to sell a piece of land. Who do they call? They call so-and-so who's in Nairobi. Can you buy this piece of land because we'd like to send our son or daughter abroad, or we'd like to foot some medical bill? You buy that piece of land, and then you put up a monstrosity of a house there, and you hardly ever go to Shackles. So you don't use this house, yet you spent millions of shillings building this. Mm-hmm. Back in Nairobi, you are struggling paying rent. You are struggling to pay school fees for your children. You are really running around chasing your own tail. Dr. Bitange Ndemo is saying, look, our culture, because this is culture, pressure from a culture, is making you do those things. But in reality, you are still suffering. And that's why he calls this debt capital. Anyway, this is my interpretation of what I read in Dr. Bitange Ndemo's article. He's on the line. Dr. Ndemo, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Did I give the story as you'd have wanted to hear it being told?
Well, sort of, except the article is very old. I do 2 articles weekly for the Nation and People's Daily, and People's and the Daily Nation and the Business Daily. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
I wrote that article about 6 or 7 years ago, but it keeps on resurfacing because that topic is very important to us as Kenyans.
It keeps resurfacing, especially going with the times. At this time, there are very many people who are in urban areas and they are, struggling and suffering, and yet they have a home back home, and they don't know how to give it back.
Let me explain it. The angle where I was coming from. I shouldn't have made the mistake that I did to do a house first in the rural area. I should have done it in Nairobi, where I stayed, where I was paying rent. Many of our seniors who were in Nairobi much earlier did the same thing by building shops in the village. And virtually across the country, most of those shops are not rented or anything. So they would put money like 100,000 and there is no return. Mm-hmm. So the basis on which we should be looking at investments, either building your house at home or a shop, is the return that you would make. Usually we say in real estate, you should get a payback within 8 years. And I know most of those shops, it will take 200 years before you get a payback. You will not be alive to benefit from the proceeds of your investments. And so I made a mistake, and it's completely dead capital. But in total, we could have put almost 20 billion US dollars, that is 200 billion Kenya shillings, into dead capital. You have seen every village has shops, and nobody's in there. I mean, from the time you finish building, and if you get a tenant, you probably get a tenant who will pay 100 shillings. So that's why we need to think very carefully that if we had invested that 20 billion US dollars into a house within Nairobi, you would have actually gotten back the payback from rent, or you would be much better off. You can pay school fees for the children. So if younger people can listen, is that there are considerations that you make when you make an investment. This is why it keeps on recurring that am I really going to benefit from putting up a 10 million house in the village? Who is going to rent it? Who is going to stay there? How many times would I visit there? So it's a very important topic, especially in a developing country like ours, where culture has been dominating and making us to make wrong decisions in investments.
But if you consider an earlier time when people primarily did not come to Nairobi to settle, they came to work and hopefully eventually go back home, would you then say that when they invested in a house that they believed they would retire to, that this was essentially a bad decision?
Oh, let me explain that. I saw with my eyes, in 93 when I was coming here, a half-acre land in Kilelesho was 3 million shillings. Half-acre land. And all my investment, all the resources I had from the US, 4 million, I put them in the village. Imagine if I had taken that 3 million out of that and bought a half-acre in Kilelesho. Today, half-acre in Kilelesho is almost 200 million. I'll be much, much better off because my house in Kishi is a small house. I cannot sell it even for 5 million.
Actually, you can't sell it at all, really.
You can't sell it at all. Meaning, I am poorer than I would have been if I had actually put the money in the city, where the returns are high.
My reference point was the example of a much, much, much earlier time than that, when people didn't come to big towns to settle.
So let's say the 60s.
Yes, and 70s. The thinking then, people didn't settle in towns. You worked in town and then went back home.
In fact, your family lived in
the rural areas. Yes, you were the one who moved from place to place.
That was a cultural aspect. That's why I'm saying our culture is not right in that space. You need to bring your family to where you are living. If you look at the music at the time, maybe from 60s to 70s, zilizopendwa.
The kabakas.
Yes, how people came to Nairobi wakapotea, makarani wakapotea. Those were pain points the families went through. When you left your wife for 5-7 years, you have never showed up in your rural home. So that's why it's important we say where you are living, where you are staying is your home. Whether I am in Wundanyi or Mombasa or Nairobi, and that's how we should look at our lives.
Indeed we should, but is that how Kenyans actually look at their lives?
Well, the aspect of prestige amechenga nyumbani, you know. If you go to run for elections, the first thing they say, akona nyumba nyumbani. But what they should be looking at, does this gentleman or lady have interests with his people? That is different. That means that whatever little resources you had, you invested it somewhere wisely, that if it increases in value, then later on you can go and build that house that the society wants.
Why do you think this is? That there's still, even till today, let's look at COVID and what has happened in the last couple of months. What is the first thing that people wanted to do? They wanted to, if they were going, they wanted to go back home. If people wanted to, if they had to stay in the city because of a job, people were then ferrying their families home while they stayed in the city, for example, to continue doing whatever job that they had. So the overwhelming reality for most people is that home is where you hang your hat, as you know, as it's said. So it's still
where the consequences of separating the family is what we have never analyzed. You stay here in Nairobi because you want your family to be safe in the rural area. They start drinking changa, you never recover those kids, or they do other things when you are not there as a parent. So there are consequences in every action that we take. It's just that we don't evaluate those consequences. And you see parenting, it's because we don't discuss it. Parenting is very complex, and the homes where the parents took care of their responsibilities, you can see the investment in their children when they are mature. So because we are blaming, right now we have a crisis of mental health. It's coming mostly to young boys, the fathers being absent. Kama mama ako na watoto nyumbani, sawa tu, you know. So we need to evaluate these things in a more deeper way so that we don't make generalizations like a man is not supposed to be home until 10 o'clock. Sasa unaenda nyumbani kwa nini na mama anasumbua wewe huko? Yeah? So we need to look at that. So you can't just say home. Home is where your parents were born. Home for us is where we live, where it makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense to me, but also at the same time, just going back into investing in the rural area. And rural area here, I'm referring to where you grew up before you then moved on to an urban area where you now work and live with your family. There's the culture of the soft benefit of investing back at home. Whether you're talking about, well, we can say don't put up a house if you're not going to live in it, but how else can you invest back at home and you get that social capital, the good feeling of knowing that you've helped to retain the connection with the people back at home, the people that brought you up, the community that you grew up with?
We still go back. I still go for funerals. I still meet people here. If you got my point very clearly, is that if I'm living in Siaya, I should build in Siaya myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you are living in Kisumu or you are living in Mombasa, that is your home. The rural area will be developed anyway if we had the freedom to do that. The reason why we are stuck with tribalism is because we have created reserve areas. I can't invest here because this is a place for Kipsigis or this is a place for Maasai. We need to change that mindset. If I am posted in Kajiado and I'm working in Kajiado County, that is my home. That is, I should build there. That is now building a future society that is more united, and that we can discuss much later, because what is happening, China is one, but there are multiple thousands of tribes within them. They are one because the numbers make them powerful in terms of global discussions. As we have divided ourselves to the point now we are saying, I want to be governor, and the governor and the county should be countries. We undermine ourselves. We cannot even negotiate as Africa. So that is why we are poor. We are poor because of cultural practices that bring division, and the people begin to look at a small group that has no power in terms of negotiation and stuff. That's why Europe is fighting to come together to create substantive number. US is large. They want to remain 50 states and have those numbers.
Professor, everything you're saying is actually true. And I personally believe what you're saying is true. But if I understand what we're talking about here, it's something fundamental. It's called the psychological needs that people have. Ideally, I should be able to live anywhere in the country, build anywhere. Ideally, it should be so. But have we actually gotten to a point where any ordinary Kenyan has gotten to the point where they can detach themselves from what we call the so-called ancestral home? Has that detachment actually taken place?
You don't detach. Let me tell you the benefits, why I'm arguing this way. And actually, you would see the point. A lot of studies in our area is that there is no way you can succeed as an entrepreneur if you invested in your village. An outsider comes and actually succeeds because of that outsiderness. Those people who have started immigrants always do well. The Jewish did well in Germany, the Lebanese in West Africa, the Indians in East Africa. And recently, the Somali refugees have come as refugees, and they are minting money in Italy when we have been hanging around here every weekend rushing home for funerals and other things. So if we left ourselves free to roam, that if we move from Nairobi to Muranga and invest, actually you do better than someone who was born in Muranga. This is a whole lesson, but I'm just taking you through so that you see the benefits of free movement of people and the people investing. In the U.S., people run away from Florida. They go to California to invest because investing within Florida becomes very difficult where the relatives are. There is another concept there where we talk about when you are very close to your relatives, you don't work hard. Yeah, people say, kama nikiwa mgonjwa, I've got my relatives here. But if I drop you in Mogadishu, you would work to hell because you know you are alone.
It sounds like something that's going to take a mind shift. For people to even come to terms with this. I mean, because just like you said, people are running home over the weekend. People don't have it that they want to do anything with any kind of permanency in a land that is not inherently their own. It has always been that, even when you're taking a break, you take a break to where you originally came from. You bury your dead where you originally came from. When you're going to marry, you go home to introduce your future spouse to the people where you originally came from. So it sounds like hundreds of years of cultural practice that would need to be changed in order for a new order to take place.
Changed or adjusted?
The discussion we are having, if I bring home the points, then you see people will begin to see. The white people displaced the Kikuyu people, isn't it?
Yes.
And displaced them from what used to be the native land, Kiambus and other places. And that displacement actually made most Kikuyus very good business people. To the extent we were saying most Kikuyus are actually anybody who had a Kikuyu name, we assume they were entrepreneurs. But look at what happened. The Luos who shifted to Mombasa, they become very successful entrepreneurs. because they shifted from home. Look at those who moved from Murang'a to Nairobi, created mega businesses here, empire. And if you compare those who remained, who used to come from Nairobi, go to Kiambu and Wamarakaa Nyumbani, they remained poorer than those who moved completely from Murang'a to Nairobi to do business. It's just that we don't discuss it. People don't study, or people write papers which you don't see as news people to discuss. This is what would change. Or look at the Kisis who moved to Ngong, that they dominate the Matatu sector in that space. They didn't have land. They were forced because land was not available anymore. So the free movement of people would make us more prosperous than thinking about this is our land as Kikuyus or Maasais or Merus or whatever. So
there's another side to that argument, and we'll come back into that, in saying when you say that people have moved and then they go and stay together in a new place, forming a new community, then you can track the prosperity. But I think also what I'm hearing from you is individuals just moving, not necessarily saying that I have moved from Kisii, I am a Kisii, and I go to Ongata Rongai because that's where the Kisiis have moved to, or going to Ongata Rongai and calling all my Kisiis to come to Ongata Rongai. But let's discuss that when we come back out of this break. 24 minutes after 8 o'clock. This is the Situation Room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation. We are having a strong conversation with Dr. Bitange Ndemo. He's a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Nairobi. Dead capital, investing back at home, putting up a house, and yet you live in a whole different area. You live in Mombasa, you are building up a home in Siaya, or you live in Oloitoktok, you're building a home in Othaya. Does that make sense? Does it not? Raising this issue of debt capital, investing in a place that you don't live and you've put up a house, and then this is all because you're shackled by your culture and customs and feeling that you must do this.
Yes, there's the aspect of the psychological needs that people have, and this is a discussion on its own. How important are these needs? And then there's the reality we now have of something called devolution. See, previously, anything in the rural areas was really just that. In the rural areas, the value aspect of it was dismal. But devolution has changed that, not altered, changed. Yes.
Which means what?
There is more money in the counties. There's more demand for this land, which was previously just ancestral land or just land in the rural areas. And there are more developments that one sees in these counties and in these rural settings than were previously seen, simply because of devolution. So even as one builds at home, there has been a change. Those dead shops that the good professor has spoken about, yes, they were probably dead for a very long time, but with the devolution, they may not necessarily all have remained dead.
Is that really changing, City? I mean, does that justify you going to put up an investment that it's not a home, for example, is not an investment, or this particular shop, so everybody comes and puts up, now they're putting up, all these high-rise apartments in the rural areas, and yet you live in Nairobi, you're paying rent.
Eric,
this thing is not giving you the returns immediately.
There's a point I'm raising here. When I talk about psychological needs, I'm talking about something like prestige. I'm talking about the need for you to be recognized by people whose recognition you consider important. All these things form a very, very fundamental core in our beings as human beings. And it also determines a lot of the things that we do. So we can't wish it away. You may be strong enough to know where to place it and where to prioritize it, but it's something that guides and determines a lot of what we do. Psychological needs.
Perhaps what the good professor is saying, we need to question these psychological needs.
We should.
And the benefits that we accrue from this.
We should.
So just because people in Shags, when I go to Shags once a while in Christmas, they'll be saying, oh, so-and-so has come back home, Eric, karibu sana, and because you put up a huge house. Of what benefit is that? Is that maybe the conversation that we should be
Start with going home for Christmas and then ask yourself, why do you have to go home for Christmas? You have a whole year. Why don't you go home in the process of that year? Why must you be on the road when everybody is doing the same thing as you? There are traffic jams. There's all sorts of congestion. Why?
Connection with the family.
Precisely that. The psychological need is just as important. This is what I'm trying to say.
Is there a place for this, Dr. Ndemo?
I think what we should say that devolution was a reaction to failure of statehood. If I felt comfortable living in Kajiado and not isolated, devolution would never have come. It was failure that the resources was not shared equally. The point, what I am arguing is that the more we divide Africa into small, tiny units, it makes us non-competitive globally, and we will never overcome issues around poverty. Because, as I told you, China, they have bitterly fought among themselves internally, but they know that remaining as China with 1.5 billion people, there is that benefit of the numbers, where innovations, research, whatnot, everything, the market becomes so big for you. Here, we cannot sell even maize to Tanzania, or we can't sell even soap. Sometimes they close. Now we have gotten into the counties. Everybody is talking about the funds flowing. I don't blame them because the nation failed. Now the flow of funds to counties, every small thing you are told there is progress, but it has killed small enterprises across the country. To move something from Makueni, you are going through Machakos and Nairobi. You see people with blocking the road to charge you cess in every point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, soon we are beginning to say, this is completely nonsense. For our children to get jobs, we must create enterprises. Those enterprises must scale. They cannot scale if we are looking at Machakos County, that this is home. They would only scale if we had a nation bigger and if we had a continent. That is why Africa Free Trade Area, which still it is in nascent stages, and every country is closing the borders. The reason why America succeeds is the numbers. The reason why China succeeds is the numbers. The reason why India is beginning to rise is because of numbers of people. India has states, but they have relaxed a lot of rules when it comes to enterprise. So we should not be defending things blindly that more money is going into the counties. We are seeing even more stupid investments in counties. Yeah, look at there's a new hotel, I think, which is built in Machakos. There would never be a payback. If you put 1 billion in Machakos, tourists don't go there. You can't choma nyama. It cannot bring the returns. So we are still making those silly dead capital. In another 5 years, if he is not governor, nobody would eat there. You see? And that's all money which would have actually gone
into something else. What else would it go to? I think if you look at it from, maybe there are those who would argue, if you look at it from an angle where you're expecting that it's foreign tourists who are going to come here, then maybe not. But if you look at providing a service that is needed now, and maybe there's a market for it now, looking at other businesses around there that are providing the same service and they have thrived, then you could say there's an argument for that. I mean, what I'm hearing you saying, Professor, is you first of all need to really interrogate before you put money into some investment. In thinking, how long is this going to take before I get a return for my investment?
And a value proposition, that there is value in this. Kisumu, you are beginning to see many more hotels.
Yep.
And I've written about it. It has the lake. If they had gaming around the waters and whatever, it can still take more. Makes sense to invest in a hotel in Kisumu to become a new tourist location. I cannot, even if you gave me free 1 billion, I cannot put that in Kisi, because you would only get teachers who will come to drink at the end of the month, and the rest of the days there is nobody patronizing that hotel.
No, Professor, the point you're making is an extremely valid one, but I want to go back to what I was saying. You see, someone who's entrepreneurial and thinks in terms of business and prioritizes that thought process will agree with you 100%. And even someone who doesn't will see the point that you're making. But is that what determines what we do? Do we make business decisions purely for business reasons, or do our psychological needs always get infused in our business decisions?
You know, before, we used to call white elephants. Someone steals money and they put some mega thing, and you see it run down because nobody's using it. And the hotels is what most former politicians use. We have a hotel in Kisumu which was put up. I don't think anybody slept there even one day. Because it was out of the town. It was inconvenient, and probably billions of shillings were put into it. And I'm saying this would have actually made much more sense if we had built an industry to process either bananas or process tea or coffee, so that we add value to our own agricultural produce. That would have made sense, because you process and ship out to sell. That's why I'm saying we should think, what contribution are we making to our people? Is it just prestige to buildings, or we do? I would rather pay school fees for 10 kids in secondary school than put up a house of my own, which is 50 million. It can't help them. It can't help you. And somebody who thinks would say, this is really nonsense. The kids here are not going to school. And
I think, Prof, you're still not answering what CT is alluding to, which is what else has contributed to that decision, the psychological aspect of it. But before you answer that, let's also hear from Victor. There's a caller, Victor, calling in from Nairobi, and he'd like to ask a question. Victor, good morning.
Yes, thank you so much. I've been listening to this, and before I make a point that I wanted to make, I wanted to ask Prof, does he have a home in Kisumu? Or when he goes back to his country, does he sleep in his mom's house or in hotels? And then I fully understand the Prof, and I've read that article, Dead Capital, and I argued with it very, very harshly. I agree with your colleague who is saying that actually psychological needs that you can't just quantify to be.
The colleague is called C.T. Muga.
C.T. Muga, yes, C.T. Muga. I fully agree with him. There are things you do not because they all make business sense, but you're actually satisfying a higher psychological need. So what maybe Prof would argue is that do not take all your savings and put up a 10 million home, and then you remain with nothing. Maybe then invest, and then from the proceeds of your investment, build whatever kind of home you want in Shackles. Nyachai is at home, he's retired. He didn't retire in Nairobi. Kibaki is at home. He lived most of his life in Nairobi. We all need homes.
He's in Nairobi as well. Retire. Victor, do you have a home in the rural area?
Yes, I do.
How often do you use that home in a year?
I visit home 10 times in a year.
Almost every month?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Now, Dr.
Ndemo
started by actually giving his own personal example, and he said, yes, he invested in putting up a house in the rural area. How often, Dr. Ndemo, do you use that house?
I've slept there 4 times in the last 20 years.
Do you see the difference now, Victor?
I see the difference, but honestly, we all know where we go eventually, and our kids really need identity. When Obama wanted to become president, look at where he came all the way to Kenya to look for his identity. It was very important, and it made a difference in his campaign.
So it's
he had a house in Chicago. He didn't build one in Washington.
So it's the same issue of the psychological need. Now, Dr. Ndemo, now you get the question again.
I want to know whether, are you a Kenyan or are you a
Daktari, I'm a Kenyan. I come from Asumbi.
Yes. Are you now? What what do you call home?
Sorry?
What do you call home?
Home is actually where I live most of the time, but also home is where my ancestral people come from, where my parents are. I have a duty to visit them. And when I visit them, culturally, I can't sleep in my mom's house. I'm married. I can't be having all my conjugal rights in my mom's house. I need my own home. And it's pathetic to do all this in a hotel.
But if we had very good hotels in Homa Bay, you could go visit and sleep there to justify.
If I want to take my family out, I would take them to a hotel. I can't turn a hotel into my house.
Ah.
So you see, there's a whole issue here, and that's where the conversation then moves into, Dr. Ndemo, the issue of the psychological need and all these other cultural needs. Victor is basically standing and arguing for the retention of those cultural ideals.
Yeah, what we should talk is not psychological but physiological. Because physiological is when you are looking at shelter, yeah. Food and clothing, basic. Yeah. What you are calling psychology is actually an aspect where you want to be recognized, where you want to make people happy.
If I may interject, Dr. Ndemo, the thing is, I'm not sure if it's really an issue of needing something to eat when you go to the rural area or having a cover over your head. It's more about the connection with your culture. And this is something that an attachment. And this is something that people do not want to throw away.
Why?
Because that is where they are from. It is their life.
It's part of their identity.
It's part of their identity. It's
so
what
must
is part
this
of their
identity come
character.
in the form of a house or a shop?
We should not be talking about identity when there are millions of young people going without fees to go to school and others. I would rather go there, spend a part of that money, take kids to school. That's a legacy now. So a legacy comes. People would come to remember. Actually, without him, so and so's kid would never have gone to school. Without this, without. You have a much deeper legacy. I put up a house there where I go and sleep, and everybody around is poor. When you die, they say, walienda walitengeneza wenyewe. So the person who gets proper legacy is the one who creates an impact within the society where they grew up, not the prestige to show that you're also successful.
So what we are saying now, if I'm hearing you right, Dr. Ndemo, is that the issue is not that you go home. The issue is that you may go home and put a lot of money in a structure, for example, that really doesn't make sense. So if you had this money, would you be then okay if somebody put up a simple structure and then use the rest of the money to influence or impact socially for good? Would be better?
Precisely.
So it's not that you shouldn't go home and put up a residence. It's that you shouldn't go home and be so fancy, and there are people around you then who may not be thriving as you are.
What I hear him saying actually is that, and even from the way you introduced it, Dr. Ndemo, you said 200 billion shillings sunk somewhere across the country in these homes, in these shops, in all, and they are not returning anything. So that shop there is not even employing people.
You see, the point I'm trying to make is this. I'm not diluting Professor Ndemo's perspective. Believe me, what he's saying is something that should be emulated, should be given thought, because it is practical and it is actually useful in the short, medium, and long term. However, there is this little thing that I keep bringing up. I'm calling it psychological needs. Let me give it a more modernistic view or a terminology. It's called neurobiological needs. Meaning, apart from just the psychological, it also takes care of those basic physiological needs that he's talking about. Unfortunately, it often takes center stage in the decisions that we make, whether they are business decisions, whether they are family decisions, but just that need, we can't run away from them. This is really what I'm trying to say.
And why is it so hard to actually unshackle ourselves? If you look at even the comments on social media, 200 billion shillings is flying. The issue is I must build back at home. I must build. Because even Dr. Ndemo is not saying that don't build. He's basically saying just evaluate how much you're putting in.
Yes. Opportunity cost is what they call it in economics. And he is right. He is 100% right. You shouldn't take all your resources and sink it into a house in the rural areas, even if you go there twice a month. It's not the best way of spending your money. I agree with him. However, the psychological needs that people have will trump all this sound logic. That's really what I'm trying to tell you.
Let me say one thing. Imagine Griffiths, Staré Boys, never went to his village in London or whatever that is. Spent all his life to grow up young people, and everywhere you go, people are proud of what he did.
They call him dad. Yes.
Yes. Why can't we have that across the country? That if I have the power to mobilize resources and see a lot of young people go through school, that when you die, 10, 20 of them are saying he was our dad. That's a better legacy. I don't know whether dead people know that, than being taken home and a few villagers come to say bye to their son who built a good house.
True.
It's a strong argument. There's a connection with both. There's a connection with, you wanting to connect with your community, the community that brought you up, and wanting to give back to that community. And very many, Dr. Ndemo would argue that even those that have put up the big 4 million, 5 million shillings homes, they also contribute to the community. Because of that home, it means that people who have a harambe for medical, people who have a harambe looking for school fees, the first person that they call when they have a harambe in church, the first person they call is our rich neighbor. And this is Dr. Ndemo, who put up 4 million shillings house. Is that not so?
That rich neighbor is what I am against. Because then it becomes like, oh, you have another lord here or something. Let's build the people so that you have several of you. I raise my WhatsApp now I raise money on WhatsApp almost on daily basis to the village. Huyu anatakiwa kwenda hospitali but that is not what we ought to be doing. We must be leading with ideas and saying, instead of this, let's do this. And be able to think much more broadly than that's why you went to school, to think much more broadly on issues that would help the village.
So I hear you saying almost that we should it's almost as if we're leaning or should be going towards a bit of socialism here, and then using social capital to make sure that everybody across board is developed more or less. Am I wrong?
All of us who are speaking here today, we are the bridge between the past and the future. The future that we are facing now, which is happening, and we are not debating it here in Africa, is that the fear in the Western world has fomented what you call the far-right movement, which will destroy what you call globalization. Africa is not discussing in that space. If you look at when globalization started, they enslaved us. We provided labor, we provided resources from Africa to build the Western world. The only way Africa can withstand the new ideologies that are emerging is Africa coming together as 1.2 billion people. That way, you can sit on the table and say, to hell, we can't import anything from Europe until we do this. Now, the outside world is so happy when we keep on talking that, oh, I come from Bungoma, And when I'm in Bungoma, I am talking about I come from this clan. It doesn't end. Even when you come to the home, you say I'm from wife number 2 of my dad. So these are the tiniest things that have brought us down as Africans. Let's think much more broadly, beyond the tribe, beyond the country. We think as Africa.
Professor, clearly you are a committed Pan-Africanist.
Yes. Do you think Liberia can tell US we don't want this?
At the moment?
No, nothing.
Indeed.
But if they were an African, if it is AU that said we will never import this from China, China would even tell you we have restructured your loan because they know they will lose. Now, the more we keep on going down that way, and I wish you can ask my colleagues in this interview that are they really from Homa Bay or from a certain clan which dictates who wins the elections? And those are the,
it's interesting that you bring that in when we only have a few minutes to go.
Yeah, that's why I said I don't want to play politics. I would do what I want to do.
Yeah.
Because this is what is dividing us. This is where the source of poverty in Africa is coming from.
Dr. Bitange Ndemo, we thank you very much for speaking to us. And also, this is, challenging our thinking, which is important, and that's what professors do. Asante sana for speaking to us, University of Nairobi Entrepreneurship Professor Dr. Bitange Ndemo, Dead Capital, our cultures, our connections to our rural homes and our investments and how we want to leave a legacy when we depart or even as we leave. We will invite you for another of these conversations soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.